What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Cardiac, and we're back here with another YouTube video on the channel. And today, in light of it being Spider-Man week and Spider-Man booster month for a lot of comic book YouTube and nerdy side of YouTube, I want to dip my hand in the hat and defend Andrew Garfield, as in this previous movie, he arguably had the best performance out of any actor that was on the screen, and a lot of this has caused people to beg and ask for Amazing Spider-Man 3 after the failure of a film that was Amazing Spider-Man 2. And a lot of people are, going back in retrospective of the Amazing Spider-Man films, and I sat down very recently, 20 minutes ago, and rewatched Amazing Spider-Man 1, and I will definitely say I have some different takeaways on it than when I originally watched it back in 2012, 2013. Hopefully I have some different takeaways, and I've gained a new appreciation of it, so much so that I believe that it actually can contend with being one of the better Spider-Man films that we've seen, but that's for later. But I want to start off the trial, the defense of Amazing Spider-Man with the acknowledgement of the motives and the goals going into this new adaptation of Spider-Man, because you see, Amazing Spider-Man 1 took place at a time after the cancelization of what would have been Spider-Man 4, directed by Sam Raimi, and in 2012 you get Sony gets Mark Webb. Sony gets Andrew Garfield fresh off the heels of acting in The Social Network, and he was one of the better and younger actors that were starting to see some promise in Hollywood, and they were able to land him and also Emma Stone for the roles to play in the new Amazing Spider-Man film. And Mark Webb, coming off the heels of one of the greatest trilogies that we've seen in superhero adaptations, one of the only trilogies that we've seen in superhero adaptations, is that Mark Webb didn't necessarily want to copy what had already been done by Sam Raimi years before. And also, he didn't want a pure comic book adaptation of the pages of Steve Ditko and Stan Lee years prior. He wanted this film to be grounded in a realism that hadn't been seen in a Spider-Man film, he argued, ever. And so with this, he said this, when you walk out of the theater, I want the world you see to resemble the world that you saw on screen. Part of the joy of cinema is that you make the impossible look real. I wanted it to be more grounded and more realistic, and that went for the emotion of the scenes, the physical action, and the wardrobe. It's less based on the Steve Ditko world and probably closer visually and influenced by Ultimate Spider-Man, but it is also very much a world of our own devising. And with this quote, and with a lot of other quotes and interviews that he was conducting at the time, the vision that Mark Webb had for this film was nowhere close to a Spider-Man that would have been directed by Sam Raimi, nowhere close to a Spider-Man of the 1980s, nowhere close to Superior Spider-Man or Spider-Man of the main 616. And you can see this in the first parts of the movie with the overimportance, I would still say, on Peter Parker's parents. I think that's one of the main gripes that most, if not everyone, has with this film. But I do think that it has its place in this adaptation. It's not the first time that we've ever seen Peter Parker's parents be spies or be clones or just have an important role into Peter Parker's story. Now, it is the first time that we've seen, at least in my history of reading Spider-Man or just knowing Spider-Man lore, it's the first time that we've seen them have an actual integral part to the origin story of Peter Parker. And with this, starting the film off, his investigation of his father's not only previous whereabouts, but also his life's work. And this brings him to come up on the spider formula and then Kirk Connors, and then he investigates that, and then he gets bit by the spider, Oscorp's involved and all that. And I think that it all ties together relatively cool. Another criticism that I saw when I was researching for this a little bit was that a lot of people were questioning, okay, I get it, your father's involved, even though I don't like that, sure, why not? If you do it right, I'll like it. And of course, he's trying to find out what his father was doing. Cross-species genetics, okay, you go to Kirk Connors, you go to Oscorp, but when you're at Oscorp, you follow this random guy? What about that? The reason he followed, and it's a visual cue in the movie, I don't know how people miss this. The paper that the folder that the guy dropped when he bumped into him in the Oscorp building when he was illegally on the internship for Oscorp was a folder with the same symbols or with part of the same equation, or at least a symbol that had been on his father's work. The two circles with like that kind of looked like an omega symbol a little bit. Those were on the same paper, which is why he followed him to see where he was going, because it's like, okay, that must be connected to my father's work, or he's going meet Dr. Connors because Dr. Connors had also just left. So it still made sense within the context of the story for him to follow the guy. That's just a dumb argument to be like, oh, you're following this random guy. It's not random. He just dropped a piece of paper that had a clue that matched up with the clue that he already had to find out either what his father was researching or where Dr. Connors was and what he was doing. And all he wanted to do was just continue the legacy of his father, or just like see what his father was doing before the man died, without saying another word to the kid. So that still makes sense. Past that point in the movie, there isn't really a mention of the parents again, so they don't overstay their welcome like I would argue they do in Amazing Spider-Man 2. They're really connected in there for no reason to. But I won't be talking about that film today or at all, because it's still ass. I'm not defending that. I'm not changing it. But also, another main criticism of these films is the fact that Andrew Garfield is too good looking to play Peter Parker. And look, in a perfect world, Tobey Maguire would still be 28 and would still play Peter Parker to this day. He would still play Peter Parker in 2010, and we would have a Spider-Man 4, and it would be amazing. Or we would just have another Peter Parker look-alike that looks like a nerd, that looks like a pure nerd, and acts like a pure nerd, and is still a good actor, and is also a good Spider-Man. But at the end of the day, this is cinema, this is film, and you have to cast people for roles based upon the ability and try to make their appearance match as much as that. Andrew Garfield in that movie is not some sexy, overly sexiest man in the world, Time magazine, with the exception of the honeymoon phase of his powers when he was exposing Flash. But as we all know, every single Peter Parker and iteration of Peter Parker has that phase to where he doesn't understand the full extent of his powers, and he's using it for not ethical reasons. And he got a consequence for that. Like, Uncle Ben got on his ass, and that also lended to the outburst that he had on Uncle Ben later, where he was confronted for failing yet another responsibility that he had. But it felt like at that moment that everything that made Peter happy, Uncle Ben was either chastising him for, or pressuring him for, or just questioning why he was doing that and not his other responsibilities. And the conflict of what he wanted to do and what he needed to do, it started expounding at that point in the film. And it all bolstered ahead and caused the outburst, combined with the fact that he was trying to continue his father's legacy with Dr. Connors, and he was doing work that he believed based on even what Uncle Ben said, which was with great power comes great responsibility. He believed that the great responsibility that he was given was to help save people, was to help save the world and continue his father's work. And the great power that he was given was the brain and the ability to solve these problems and to be a scientist and aid Dr. Connors in that. So the fact that he was chastising Peter for doing what he believed was the right thing in opposed to doing something that Aunt May needed to get home, but that she was more than capable of doing by herself in his eyes, and even in her eyes, it led to that outbreak. Real quick, another thing I wanted to point out is that yes, one of the aspects of Peter Parker in the comics and in other iterations is that anyone could have gotten bit by the spider. And in this movie, because of his connection to the parents and because of the way that he gets bitten and how he ends up in that place at all, isn't really dependent on just wrong time at the wrong place or right time at the right place. I said that backwards, but either way. The fact that his parents are involved does take that aspect away from it. The fact that Spider-Man could have been anyone, or that anyone could have been bitten by the spider. But also, I think that people over-exaggerate that point when they're discussing Spider-Man. Not anyone could have been Spider-Man. Anyone could have been bit by the spider. And I think that this movie replaces the fact that, yeah, not anyone could have been bit by the spider, but they over expound on the fact that also not anyone could be Spider-Man. The thing about this Peter Parker is that with it being more grounded in reality, also that takes away Peter Parker's mysticism, which was a point that the director Mark Webb wanted to make, but it gives Peter less idealistic traits, more selfishness, more recklessness, less understanding of the situations that he has to do compared to what he wants to do. And even with Spider-Man in the first half of the movie, he's extremely selfish. He wants revenge. That's the main thing. That's one of the main criticisms of early Peter Parker in this film. But I think that gives him an arc. No, it's not the Peter Parker that we know, and it's not even Ultimate Spider-Man all the way, but it's kind of giving, in my opinion, Peter Parker, it's like replacing the Peter Parker that we all know and love with the average protagonist from 2012. The punk rock aesthetic, the darker tone, the more selfishness, and it grows him up through the tragedies, through the mistakes, through the selfishness, through the recklessness, and it makes it more relatable because most people would do the same thing in those situations. Granted, that's not supposed to be the point of Peter Parker. Peter Parker is supposed to show us who we should be, but I think that this iteration of Peter Parker shows us who we are and shows us the things that separate who we are and who Peter Parker now is at the end of the film. Or I'll say right before the end of the film, before he backstabs himself and gets back with Gwen, presumably. We know at the beginning of the next movie they're back together. But I do think that the dark and grittiness and the more selfishness and the changes that they make to Peter's motivations gives him an arc that we don't see in, at least this developed on, in most Spider-Man origin stories. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, and I think that I think that the writers, and I think that Andrew's performance does it a great favor. Through the more personal mistakes of helping Dr. Connors, and then he turns into the Lizard. The tragedy of Captain Stacy's death and the events in the story, like seeing how important it is to save people instead of just beating up bad guys, like saving the child on the bridge, and seeing how important that was, and seeing all of New York come together to aid him, showed him what it meant to be the Peter Parker that we all know and love. Granted, by the beginning of the next movie, he's not completely that, but still towards the tail end of this movie, we do see that shine through. And if it would have ended at that point, I think it would have been a absolutely great and amazing Spider-Man movie. But even still, the movie is about Peter Parker trying to be the best person he can be. Through those mistakes, learning to accept responsibility, making sacrifices for the sake of a better world and better situation for the people he loves. And at the end of the movie, he still ends it alone, with more people to save and protect, except Gwen. Also, that final swing was amazing. Stop hating on Andrew Garfield. I would be all for an Amazing Spider-Man 3. Hopefully it's not Mark Webb, though. I do hope that they get a different director. But that movie's not bad. It's not bad at all. And stop shitting on it. Hope y'all have a good day. Talk to y'all later. And peace.